The wind was a blade against the high plains, sharpening itself on the bones of the mountains and slicing through the thin timber of the cabin. Elias felt it in his own bones, a familiar ache that spoke of winter's dominion. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white, a furious, churning void that had swallowed the sun and the land whole. Inside, the only world that mattered was the one carved out by the flickering light of the hearth. The fire was his one constant, a living, breathing creature of orange and gold that held the deeper, more predatory cold at bay. He sat in a worn chair, the wood smooth beneath his scarred hands, a tin cup of bitter coffee cooling on the floor beside him. He did not drink it. He simply watched the flames dance, their movement a silent language he had come to understand. Each pop and hiss was a word, a memory. For 5 years, this cabin had been his penance and his sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of his past could scream without anyone else hearing them. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts: regret, silence, and a grim competence for survival. He had come here to let the man he used to be die, but the phantom still lingered, a shadow clinging to his own. That was when he heard it. Not a sound of the storm, but something alien to its rhythm. A soft, heavy thud against the cabin door, almost lost in the howl of the wind. Elias froze. Nothing came to this door. Nothing ever should. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, the scrape of his chair legs on the floorboards loud in the sudden stillness of his own making. He took the rifle from its pegs beside the fireplace, the weight of the steel a cold, familiar comfort in his hands. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the rough-hewn wood. He heard nothing but the blizzard's roar. He waited. A minute passed, then another. Perhaps it was just the wind, playing tricks with a loose shutter or a fallen branch. But the memory of the sound was too distinct, too solid. It was the sound of a body falling. With his rifle held ready, he unlatched the bar and pulled the door inward. A blast of ice and snow surged into the room, momentarily blinding him. There, half buried in a fresh drift against his threshold, was a figure. A woman. Her dark hair was fanned out against the snow, matted with ice. Her clothes were torn, her face a pale, bloodless mask. He knelt, the wind tearing at him, and saw the impossible angles of her legs beneath the tattered fabric of her trousers. They were broken, not by a fall but with a vicious, deliberate violence. A flicker of something ancient and terrible ignited in his chest. He knew this kind of cruelty. He had once dealt in it. Without a second thought, he holstered the rifle, scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the raging storm. He laid her gently on the bearskin rug before the fire, the sudden warmth of the cabin a shocking contrast to the deathly cold of her skin. Her eyes fluttered open, dark pools of terror and pain. She tried to scramble back, a choked sob catching in her throat, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her. She gasped, her face contorting. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rasp, unused to speech. "You're safe here." He moved to the hearth, stoking the fire until it blazed, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on the grate. He did not look at her, sensing her fear of him, of this strange place, of a man who looked more like the wilderness than a savior. He let the silence stretch, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the storm's distant fury. When the water was hot, he tore strips from a clean shirt and gently began to clean the cuts on her face. She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away, her eyes tracking his every move. He worked with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He said nothing of her legs. Not yet. He knew the pain that was coming, and he would not add to her terror by speaking of it. He brought her a cup of hot broth, holding it to her lips. She drank, her gaze never leaving his. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice fragile as ice. "Elias." He offered nothing more. He sat back in his chair, keeping his vigil, his rifle resting across his lap. For the first time in years, The silence of his cabin was not empty. It was filled with another's pain, another's fear, and it changed the very nature of the air he breathed. The storm raged for 2 days. In that time they spoke little. He learned her name was Lena. He learned it when she cried it out in a feverish sleep. On the second day, the fever broke, and the pain in her legs became a sharp, lucid agony. She looked at him, her eyes clear and desperate. "My legs," she said, the words a statement of fact, not a question. He nodded grimly. I know he had gathered what he needed. 2 straight, sturdy lengths of wood from a broken crate, more clean cloth for binding, a bottle of whiskey from a dusty shelf. He knelt beside her. "This is going to hurt," he said, his voice flat with unwelcome truth. "There's no other way." He offered her the whiskey. She shook her head, her jaw set. "Just do it." He held her gaze for a long moment, seeing not just fear, but a core of steel he recognized. He nodded once. The sound of bones setting was a sickening crack that echoed the snapping of frozen branches outside. She screamed, a raw, piercing sound that seemed to tear at the very logs of the cabin. But she did not fight him. She gripped the fur rug, her knuckles white, tears streaming down her face as he worked, splinting and binding her legs with a practiced, brutal necessity. When it was done, he was sweating, and she was limp with exhaustion and pain, her breath coming in ragged sobs. He covered her with a thick wool blanket. His touch on her shoulder meant to be reassuring. She flinched away. Later, as dusk painted the single window a deep, bruised purple, she spoke, her voice a hollow whisper from the rug. They were amusing themselves. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "They caught me on the old trade road. 3 of them." Her voice broke, and she began to weep, not loudly, but with the deep, shuddering grief of someone who had seen the absolute worst of humanity. "They didn't take anything. Not my horse, not my money." She took a ragged breath. "They broke my legs for fun." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and poisonous. Elias felt that old, familiar fire in his gut turn to ice. He looked down at the scars that mapped his own knuckles, ghosts of old brawls and settled scores. He had lived in a world where men did such things. He had been one of those men. He had run from that world, from that version of himself, believing he could bury it under years of solitude and snow. But it had found him. It had been delivered, broken and bleeding, to his door. He said nothing. He simply stood, walked to the window, and stared out into the waning storm. The casual cruelty she described was a signature, a brand. He knew who did this. Not their names, perhaps, but their kind. They were jackals who followed a lion. And he knew the lion's name. Kale. A name from a past he had tried to murder with silence. A cold dread, sharp and clear, settled over him. They would not have left a witness. They would be back. The 3rd morning dawned with a blinding, pristine beauty. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean, draped in a blanket of undisturbed snow under a pale blue sky. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of the hunter. Elias saw them first. 3 riders, black specks moving slowly against the vast whiteness of the valley floor. They were not moving with purpose, but with the patient, circling pattern of predators searching for a lost kill. He turned from the window, his face a granite mask. Lena was watching him, her fear a palpable thing in the room. "They're here," she stated, her voice trembling. He didn't deny it. He walked to the hearth and took a small, leather-bound book from the mantel. It was a worn volume of poetry, the only thing he'd taken from his old life that wasn't a weapon. He handed it to her. "Read," he said. "Don't look up. No matter what you hear." Her eyes widened, searching his. For a moment, she saw past the stoic mask to the haunted man beneath. She saw the storm inside him was far more violent than the one that had just passed. She clutched the book and nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He checked his rifle, chambering around with a final metallic click. He barred the door. He moved a heavy table in front of the single window, leaving only a small gap to see through, to shoot through. He was no longer a hermit. He was a sentinel. He was what he had always been, beneath the quiet, cornered animal, ready to kill. An hour later they were at the cabin. He watched them dismount, their laughter carrying on the crisp, cold air. One of them was large and bearded, the other wiry and nervous. The third man, the leader, walked with a swagger that Elias recognized across a distance of 100 yards in 5 years.
Kale.
He hadn't changed. Still the same cruel smile, the same arrogant tilt of his head. Cale strode to the door and pounded on it. "Hello, the house. We're looking for a lady who got lost in the storm. Wondering if you've seen her." Elias remained silent, his rifle steady. Cale waited, then laughed. "Quiet one, are you?" No matter. He turned to his men. "She crawled in here. I can feel it. Break it down." The bearded man swung the butt of his rifle against the door. The wood groaned but held. He swung again. From her place by the fire, Lena let out a small, terrified gasp. Elias didn't turn. "Read," he commanded, his voice low and deadly calm. The bearded man swung a third time, and the latch splintered. As the door flew inward, Elias fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bearded man crumpled without a sound, a dark flower blooming on his chest. The wiry one stared, paralyzed with shock, before fumbling for his own pistol. Elias's second shot took him in the throat. He fell back, gurgling, into the snow. It was over in 2 seconds. Cale stood frozen, his hand on his gun belt, his arrogant smile gone, replaced by a look of disbelief. He stared past the bodies of his men, into the shadows of the cabin. "Elias?" he breathed, the name a curse. "I heard you were dead." "You heard wrong," Elias said, stepping partly into the light. Cale's eyes darted around the cabin, saw the form huddled by the fire. He understood. A slow, venomous smile spread across his face. "Her. Well, I'll be. Still trying to save strays, Elias? Thought I beat that out of you. Get on your horse and ride, Cale." "I don't think so. You and I have unfinished business. And besides," he gestured with his chin toward Lena. "She saw our faces. Can't have that." Cale drew his pistol with blinding speed. But Elias was already moving. He didn't fire. He dove to the side as Cale's shot splintered the doorframe where his head had been. He rolled behind the heavy table just as another bullet tore through the window, showering the floor with glass. The sanctuary was violated, broken. Elias came up, firing not at Cale, but at the support beam of the small porch roof, already heavy with snow. He fired twice. The bullets chewed through the weathered wood. With a great groaning crack, the roof gave way, dumping a half-ton of snow and timber directly onto Cale. It happened so fast Cale didn't even have time to scream. There was only the dull, heavy whump of the impact, and then silence. The profound, ringing silence that follows sudden violence. Elias rose slowly, his rifle held low. He walked to the doorway and looked out. 2 men dead in the snow, a third buried beneath it. The clean white landscape was scarred with death. He turned back into the cabin. Lena was staring at him, the open book forgotten in her lap. The terror was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, somber understanding. She saw the cost of her safety etched on his face. He was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the effort of caging the beast he had just unleashed. He walked to the broken window, ignoring the cold air that now flowed freely into the room. He looked out not at the bodies but at the mountains beyond. They were still and silent, indifferent. He had protected his sanctuary by destroying it. He had saved her by becoming the man he had run from. He felt her gaze on his back. "Elias," she said, her voice quiet but strong. He turned to face her. The firelight played across his face, illuminating the exhaustion, the pain, and something new, a flicker of release. He had not just killed 3 men. He had killed 3 ghosts. He walked to the fire and knelt, not beside her, but before the hearth, adding a new log to the flames. The wood caught, and the fire grew stronger, pushing back the cold that seeped through the shattered window, bathing them both in its steady, golden light. They were 2 broken people in a broken cabin, surrounded by a brutal world. But for the first time in a long time, neither of them was alone. And in the quiet warmth, that was enough. It was everything.